I wanted respect. I wanted my voice to be heard in boardrooms where 20-something MBAs dismissed my decades of experience with condescending smiles. When I pitched my sustainable packaging concept to the executive team at Morrison Associates, they actually laughed. The VP of Innovation called it cute grandma ideas right to my face. But the last thing they expected was for me to walk into that same office 18 months later as their new owner, watching their smug faces crumble as security escorted them out. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name was Margaret Sullivan, and at 64 years old, I had spent the better part of 4 decades climbing corporate ladders that seemed designed to keep women like me perpetually 2 rungs from the top. I was the Senior Director of Operations at Morrison Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm in downtown Seattle that specialized in helping companies optimize their business potential, corporate speak for cutting costs and maximizing profits, usually at the expense of employee welfare and environmental responsibility. For 37 years, I had been the steady hand that kept that company running. I was the one who streamlined their processes when they were hemorrhaging money in 2008. I was the one who retained their top talent when competitors were poaching left and right during the tech boom. I was the one who negotiated the contracts that kept them afloat during the pandemic when half their clients disappeared overnight. But despite my track record, despite my results, despite the fact that I had personally saved that company from bankruptcy twice, I was never invited to the real conversations that mattered. I worked in a glass office on the 14th floor, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of Elliott Bay. Every morning, I would arrive at 7:30 a.m., exactly 30 minutes before anyone else, and sit at my mahogany desk with my first cup of coffee, watching the ferries glide across the water like white ghosts in the morning mist. My office was impeccably organized, client files arranged alphabetically, quarterly reports bound in color-coded folders, a small jade plant on the windowsill that had somehow survived 23 relocations and countless office renovations. My colleagues respected my efficiency, but they didn't respect my vision. They saw me as the reliable workhorse, the woman who could execute other people's ideas flawlessly but who wasn't innovative enough to generate her own. When the younger executives talked about disruptive thinking and paradigm shifts, they spoke around me, not to me. I was furniture in their meetings, necessary, functional, but not worth consulting for anything beyond operational details. The irony was suffocating. I had been watching industries evolve, markets shift, and consumer behavior change for decades. I had seen trends emerge and disappear, watched companies rise and fall based on their ability to adapt. I had insights that came from lived experience, from watching the same patterns repeat across different economic cycles, from understanding the long-term consequences of short-term thinking. But when I spoke up in strategy meetings, when I offered suggestions based on my observations, I was met with polite nods and immediate pivots to more pressing matters. The worst part wasn't the dismissal itself, it was the way they dismissed me. There was never outright hostility, never direct confrontation. Instead, there was a patronizing gentleness, a tone reserved for elderly relatives who had wandered into conversations beyond their comprehension. They would smile, thank me for my valuable perspective, and then proceed as if I hadn't spoken at all. My ideas were filed away in the same mental folder as outdated technology and discontinued products, acknowledged but irrelevant. I had been married once, to a man named Robert who died of a heart attack 7 years earlier while playing tennis at our country club. We had never had children, not by choice but by circumstance, and after his death, I threw myself even deeper into my work. The office became my family, the company became my legacy, and my colleagues became the closest thing I had to relationships. Outside of my book club and my weekly bridge games with 3 other widows who understood the particular loneliness of outliving your spouse, but work relationships built on hierarchy and professional necessity are fragile things. They exist only within the confines of shared objectives and mutual benefit. When I tried to push beyond those boundaries, when I attempted to contribute ideas that challenged the established order, I discovered just how conditional that acceptance really was. The sustainable packaging idea had been brewing in my mind for months. I had been watching the growing consumer demand for environmentally responsible products, reading reports about microplastics in the ocean, following the legislative movements toward corporate environmental accountability. I saw an opportunity that seemed so obvious, so inevitable, that I couldn't understand why no one else was talking about it. Companies were going to need sustainable packaging solutions within the next 5 years, not because they wanted to, but because they would be legally required to. The smart play was to get ahead of the curve, to position Morrison Associates as the consulting firm that could help businesses navigate that transition before their competitors caught up. I spent 3 weeks developing the proposal. I researched market trends, compiled case studies, created financial projections, and drafted implementation timelines. I worked late into the evening, staying at the office until the cleaning crew arrived, fueled by the excitement of finally having something substantial to contribute to the company's strategic direction. I imagined presenting the idea to the executive committee, seeing recognition in their eyes, finally being invited into the inner circle where real decisions were made. The presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in the main conference room, a sleek, modern space with a glass table that could seat 20 people and a wall-mounted screen for presentations. The executive team filed in one by one: James Morrison III, the CEO and grandson of the company's founder; Sarah Chen, the VP of Business Development who had been hired away from Amazon 2 years earlier; Marcus Rodriguez, the VP of Innovation, who was barely 30 and spoke exclusively in startup jargon; and Jennifer Walsh, the CFO who had a reputation for shutting down any proposal that couldn't demonstrate immediate ROI. I had prepared meticulously. My slides were clean and professional, my talking points were rehearsed, and my supporting data was comprehensive. I wore my best navy suit, the one I reserved for client presentations and board meetings, and I had my hair styled at the salon the night before. I wanted to look the part of a serious strategist, not just the operations manager who kept the trains running on time. For the first 10 minutes, everything went according to plan. I presented the market research, explained the regulatory trends, and outlined the business opportunity. The room was quiet, attentive. I felt like I was finally being heard, finally being taken seriously as a strategic thinker rather than just an operational executor. Then Marcus started asking questions. Not the kind of questions that sought clarification or demonstrated engagement, but the kind designed to expose weaknesses and create doubt. He questioned my data sources, challenged my projections, and suggested that sustainable packaging was just another passing trend that would burn out once the novelty wore off. His tone was dismissive, condescending, like a professor correcting a student who had misunderstood a basic concept. Sarah joined in next, pointing out that their existing clients hadn't expressed interest in sustainability initiatives. She suggested that I was getting ahead of myself and that the company should focus on proven revenue streams rather than chasing hypothetical markets. Her criticism was wrapped in corporate politeness, but the message was clear: this was not the kind of thinking they expected from someone in my position. James listened to the back and forth with a neutral expression, occasionally nodding or making notes on his tablet. I had worked with him for over a decade, had seen him through 3 major business pivots and countless strategic challenges. I thought he knew my capabilities, respected my judgment. But when the questions died down, and he finally spoke, his words cut deeper than any outright rejection. "Margaret," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of patient authority that men in power use when they're about to deliver disappointing news, "I appreciate the effort you've put into this proposal. It's clear you've done your homework. But I think we need to be realistic about where our strengths lie as a company. We're very good at operational efficiency and process optimization. That's what our clients come to us for, and that's what we should continue to focus on." He paused, glancing around the table at the other executives, who nodded in agreement like a Greek chorus affirming the wisdom of their leader. "This sustainability angle," he continued, "it feels like something our competitors are better positioned to handle. Companies with younger teams, more flexibility, more experience in emerging markets. We should stick to what we do best." The phrase "younger teams" hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. It wasn't explicitly about my age, but everyone in the room understood the subtext. I was too old, too set in my ways, too disconnected from current trends to understand what modern businesses really needed, but it was Marcus who delivered the final blow. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the conference room, he leaned back in his chair with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "Thanks for the presentation, Margaret. It's nice to see you trying to think outside the box. Very entrepreneurial of you. Though I have to say, some of these ideas feel a bit like what my grandmother would suggest if she were trying to start a business." The room erupted in nervous laughter. Not malicious, not cruel, but the kind of laughter that comes when someone says something that everyone was thinking but no one wanted to voice. The kind of laughter that acknowledges a shared understanding while simultaneously excluding the person who doesn't get the joke. I stood there for a moment, my presentation materials clutched against my chest, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. 37 years of loyal service, of problem solving, of keeping this company alive through multiple crises, and this was how they saw me. Not as a strategic thinker, not as a valuable contributor, but as someone's well-meaning grandmother who had wandered into a conversation she didn't understand. I smiled, nodded politely, and walked out of that conference room with as much dignity as I could muster. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The respect I thought I had earned, the position I thought I had secured, the future I thought I was building, all of it was revealed to be an illusion. I was not a valued member of the leadership team. I was not a strategic partner. I was an aging employee whose best years were behind her, tolerated out of habit and politeness but no longer considered capable of meaningful contribution. That afternoon, I sat in my glass office, staring out at Elliott Bay, watching the same ferries trace the same routes they had been traveling for decades. Reliable, predictable, essential for transportation but invisible to most people who took their service for granted. I realized, with a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying, that I had become one of those ferries. Functional but forgettable. Necessary but not noteworthy. For the first time in my professional life, I began to wonder what would happen if I simply stopped showing up. Would they notice immediately, or would it take days for someone to realize that the person who kept everything running smoothly was no longer there? And more importantly, if they could dismiss my ideas so easily, if they could laugh at my vision so casually, what else were they capable of dismissing about me? That night, I went home to my empty house in the Queen Anne neighborhood, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat in my living room surrounded by the accumulated possessions of a life well lived but somehow incomplete. Awards from various professional organizations, photos from company retreats, books on business strategy that I had read and annotated but never been asked to implement. I had spent 4 decades building someone else's dream, sacrificing my own ambitions for the stability and security of a steady paycheck and a comfortable position. But comfort, I was beginning to understand, was just another word for complacency. And complacency was the enemy of possibility. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The weeks following the boardroom humiliation passed in a strange haze of routine and rebellion. I continued showing up to Morrison Associates every morning at 7:30 a.m., continued managing my operational responsibilities with the same meticulous attention to detail that had defined my career. But something essential had changed. I was no longer working for them, I was studying them. It started innocently enough. During lunch breaks, instead of eating my usual turkey sandwich at my desk while reviewing client files, I began taking walks around downtown Seattle. I would wander through Pike Place Market, observing how small business owners interacted with their customers, how they adapted to changing foot traffic patterns, how they pivoted their offerings based on seasonal demands. I watched street vendors negotiate with suppliers, listened to cafe owners discuss their profit margins with startling transparency, and noticed how even the smallest enterprises operated with an entrepreneurial agility that Morrison and Associates, for all its corporate sophistication, completely lacked. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I found myself in a small bookstore tucked between a vintage clothing shop and a kombucha brewery. The owner, a woman probably 15 years younger than me, with silver-streaked hair and paint-stained fingers, was reorganizing her business section while humming softly to herself. I struck up a conversation about her inventory choices, and she began explaining how she had transformed a failing used bookstore into a thriving community hub by adding author readings, book clubs, and writing workshops. The previous owner thought books were just products, she told me, carefully arranging volumes on entrepreneurship and small business management. But books are connections. They're conversations waiting to happen. Once I figured that out, everything else fell into place. Her words hit me with unexpected force. Morrison and Associates treated consulting like a product, standardized solutions delivered efficiently to maximize billable hours. But what if consulting could be something more? What if it could be about genuine transformation rather than temporary fixes? What if the real value lay not in implementing cookie-cutter strategies, but in understanding the unique DNA of each business and helping it evolve authentically? I bought 3 books that day: The Lean Startup, by Eric Ries, Blue Ocean Strategy, by W. Chan Kim, and The Innovator's Dilemma, by Clayton Christensen. Books I had heard discussed in countless meetings but had never taken the time to read myself, assuming that my operational expertise was sufficient for my role. That assumption, I realized, had been one of many mistakes that had kept me trapped in middle management while others advanced around me. That night, I read until 2 a.m., making notes in the margins, cross-referencing concepts with my own observations from nearly 4 decades in corporate environments. The sustainable packaging idea that had been so dismissively rejected suddenly revealed itself as just the tip of an iceberg. There were dozens of emerging market opportunities that established consulting firms were either ignoring or approaching with outdated methodologies. The next morning, I arrived at the office with a different energy. I still performed my duties with professional competence, but I was now conducting a covert anthropological study of Morrison and Associates itself. I began paying attention to things I had previously taken for granted: the way decisions were made, the way information flowed through the organization, the way younger employees were subtly excluded from strategic conversations despite their fresh perspectives, and the way long-term employees like myself were pigeonholed into operational roles regardless of our evolving capabilities. During my lunch hour that Friday, I did something I had never done in 37 years of employment. I accessed the company's financial records. As Senior Director of Operations, I had legitimate access to budget reports, revenue projections, and client billing data, but I had always used this access purely for operational purposes. Now, I studied those numbers with the eye of an investor. Rather than an employee, what I discovered was both shocking and illuminating. Morrison Associates was far more financially vulnerable than anyone in leadership seemed willing to acknowledge. Their client retention rate had been declining steadily for 3 years, masked by aggressive new client acquisition that was becoming increasingly expensive and unsustainable. Their profit margins were shrinking as competitors offered more innovative services at lower prices. Most tellingly, their average client engagement had shortened from 18 months to 8 months over the past 5 years, indicating that businesses were viewing their services as temporary necessities rather than long-term partnerships. The company was surviving on its reputation and existing relationships, but it wasn't thriving. It wasn't adapting. It wasn't preparing for the massive shifts that were already reshaping the consulting industry. The leadership team that had so confidently dismissed my sustainability proposal was presiding over a slow-motion corporate decline, too proud or too blind to recognize the warning signs that were obvious to anyone willing to look beyond quarterly revenue reports. I began researching Morrison & Associates competitors, spending my evenings diving deep into their websites, reading their case studies, analyzing their service offerings. I discovered boutique consulting firms that were generating higher client satisfaction scores by specializing in niche areas that Morrison & Associates ignored. I found startup consultancies that were winning contracts by offering equity partnerships instead of traditional fee structures. I encountered independent consultants who were building million-dollar practices by focusing on specific industries or transformation challenges that larger firms considered too narrow or too risky. The pattern became clear: the consulting industry was fragmenting. Clients no longer wanted generalist firms that promised to solve everything. They wanted specialists who understood their specific challenges, their industry dynamics, their cultural constraints. They wanted partners who were willing to share risk, not just vendors who delivered reports and walked away. But the most revelatory discovery came when I started researching the individual backgrounds of Morrison & Associates' current leadership team. James Morrison III had an MBA from Wharton but had never worked anywhere except the family business. Sarah Chen had impressive credentials from her time at Amazon, but her experience was entirely in e-commerce, not traditional consulting. Marcus Rodriguez had a computer science degree and had worked for 2 failed startups before joining Morrison & Associates as their innovation expert. Jennifer Walsh was a competent CFO, but her background was in accounting, not strategic finance. None of them had the breadth of industry experience that I had accumulated. None of them had managed operations through multiple economic cycles. None of them had the deep client relationships that I had built over decades of solving actual business problems rather than just theorizing about them. Yet somehow, these were the people making strategic decisions about the company's future, while my ideas were dismissed as grandma thinking. The irony was suffocating, but it was also energizing. If they were so confident in their superior judgment, if they were so certain that my decades of experience were irrelevant to modern business challenges, then they wouldn't mind a little competition. They wouldn't be threatened by an old lady starting her own consulting practice. After all, according to them, I was too outdated to understand current market dynamics. I began working on a business plan during my evenings and weekends, treating it initially as an intellectual exercise rather than a serious proposal. I outlined service offerings that addressed the gaps I had identified in Morrison & Associates' approach. I researched potential clients who were underserved by traditional consulting firms. I developed pricing models that were more flexible and results-oriented than the billable hour structure that dominated the industry. The more I worked on the plan, the more feasible it became. I had a substantial savings account, accumulated over decades of careful financial management and boosted by Robert's life insurance policy. I had professional relationships with dozens of former clients who had expressed frustration with Morrison & Associates' cookie-cutter approach. I had operational knowledge that could help me avoid the common mistakes that destroyed most consulting startups in their first year. Most importantly, I had something that none of my younger colleagues possessed: nothing left to lose. At 64, I wasn't trying to build a career that would last 30 years. I wasn't worried about professional reputation in the traditional sense. I wasn't concerned about fitting into existing industry hierarchies or following conventional paths to success. I could take risks that would be career suicide for someone in their 30s or 40s. 3 months after the boardroom humiliation, I had a complete business plan for Sullivan Strategic Solutions, a boutique consulting firm specializing in sustainable business transformation for mid-market companies. The plan included detailed financial projections, marketing strategies, operational procedures, and a client acquisition timeline that could generate positive cash flow within 6 months. But a business plan, I realized, was just an academic exercise until it became action. And action required courage, the courage to walk away from a secure position, to bet on myself instead of hiding behind someone else's brand, to prove that the old lady business ideas they had mocked were actually more innovative than anything they were capable of conceiving. The decision crystallized on a Wednesday morning in late October. I was sitting in another strategy meeting, listening to Marcus present his latest, disruptive innovation initiative, a proposal to help clients implement AI chatbots for customer service. The irony was stunning. 6 months after dismissing my sustainability proposal as outdated thinking, they were now chasing the most overhyped trend in business technology, completely ignoring the fact that most of their clients were still struggling with basic digital transformation challenges. Jennifer Walsh was nodding enthusiastically, already calculating the billable hours they could generate from AI implementation projects. Sarah Chen was taking notes, probably planning how to leverage her Amazon experience to position Morrison Associates as experts in artificial intelligence. James Morrison III was smiling with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he was witnessing strategic brilliance. None of them seemed to recognize that they were proposing to solve tomorrow's problems for clients who hadn't yet figured out today's challenges. None of them understood that sustainable competitive advantage came from helping businesses build adaptive capacity, not from implementing whatever technology happened to be trending in Harvard Business Review. I sat in that meeting, watching these supposedly brilliant minds chase shiny objects while ignoring fundamental business principles, and I felt the last vestige of respect for their judgment evaporate. They weren't visionary leaders. They were followers, desperately trying to stay relevant by mimicking what they thought innovative companies were doing, without understanding why those approaches might or might not work for their specific client base. That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Patricia Williams, a former Morrison Associates client who had left after expressing frustration with their rigid approach to organizational change. Patricia ran a successful manufacturing company that was struggling to implement sustainable practices while maintaining profitability, exactly the kind of challenge that my sustainability expertise could address. "Margaret," she said when I reached her, "what a pleasant surprise. Are you calling about that process optimization project we discussed?" "Actually," I replied, my heart racing with the audacity of what I was about to propose, "I'm calling to discuss something entirely different. I'm starting my own consulting practice, and I think we should talk about how I might be able to help you with some of the challenges that Morrison Associates wasn't equipped to handle." There was a pause, then a laugh that carried genuine delight. "Well, this is interesting. Tell me more." The second call was to David Chen, a commercial real estate broker who had helped Robert and me purchase our house 15 years earlier. David specialized in office spaces for professional services firms, and I had a very specific request. "I need you to find me information about a particular building," I told him. "The Morrison Tower on 4th Avenue. I want to know who owns it, what the lease terms look like, and whether there might be any opportunities for a new tenant to acquire space there." David was quiet for a moment. "Margaret, isn't that where you work?" "Yes," I said, feeling a smile spread across my face for the first time in months. "That's exactly why I'm interested." By the end of that week, I had scheduled 3 client consultations and identified a potential office space just 2 floors below Morrison Associates' current location. The building owner, it turned out, was frustrated with Morrison Associates' frequent late rent payments and was actively seeking more reliable tenants. The plan was coming together faster than I had anticipated, but I wasn't ready to act yet. I needed more preparation, more research, more strategic thinking. Most importantly, I needed to understand exactly how vulnerable Morrison Associates really was, because if I was going to compete with them, I wanted to do more than just steal a few clients. I wanted to replace them entirely. The transformation from employee to entrepreneur required more than just courage, it demanded a complete rewiring of how I approached risk, relationships, and my own professional identity. For 37 years, I had operated within the safety net of corporate structure, where my responsibilities were clearly defined, my income was predictable, and my decisions were filtered through layers of hierarchy. Now I was preparing to step into a world where every choice would be mine to make and mine to live with. My evenings became intensive strategy sessions conducted at my dining room table, surrounded by legal pads covered in financial projections, market analysis, and Operational timelines. The methodical approach that had served me well in corporate operations now became the foundation for building something entirely my own. But entrepreneurship, I was discovering, required a different kind of precision, one that accounted for uncertainty rather than eliminating it. The first major decision involved timing. I couldn't simply quit Morrison Associates and hope for the best. I needed to build momentum before making the leap, which meant months of careful preparation, while maintaining my full-time responsibilities. This delicate balance required a level of compartmentalization that I had never attempted before. By day, I was Margaret Sullivan, Senior Director of Operations, dutifully managing project timelines and client deliverables. By night, I was the founder of Sullivan Strategic Solutions, researching competitors and developing service offerings that would directly challenge my current employer. The ethical considerations were complex but not paralyzing. I wasn't planning to steal proprietary information or violate any confidentiality agreements. Instead, I was leveraging my own expertise, my own relationships, and my own understanding of market gaps that Morrison Associates had chosen to ignore. If they viewed my insights as worthless, they could hardly claim ownership of them when I chose to apply those insights elsewhere. My first major breakthrough came through an unexpected source, LinkedIn. I had maintained a professional profile for years, mainly as a networking tool for industry conferences and client communications, but I had never used it strategically. Now I began systematically connecting with former Morrison Associates clients, suppliers, and even employees who had left for other opportunities. The conversations that emerged from these connections revealed a pattern that was both encouraging and damning. Client after client expressed variations of the same frustration. Morrison Associates delivered competent but uninspired solutions that felt generic rather than tailored to their specific challenges. They appreciated the firm's reliability but wished for more innovation, more creativity, more genuine partnership in solving complex problems. Several mentioned that they had stopped bringing their most interesting challenges to Morrison Associates because they knew the response would be a standardized framework rather than original thinking. Former employees told even more revealing stories. Two different people described the same phenomenon, promising ideas being dismissed in internal meetings, only to be quietly appropriated months later and presented as leadership initiatives. A former analyst mentioned that several junior staff members had left because they felt their contributions were being systematically undervalued, while a former project manager described a culture where innovative thinking was discouraged unless it came from the executive team. The picture that emerged was of a company that had become comfortable with mediocrity, coasting on its established reputation while gradually losing its competitive edge. More importantly, it was a company that was systematically wasting its human capital by failing to recognize and nurture talent that didn't fit traditional hierarchical patterns. This intelligence gathering phase revealed something crucial. I wasn't the only person who had been undervalued at Morrison Associates. There was a pool of talented individuals who had left the company specifically because their capabilities weren't being recognized or utilized effectively. These people represented potential allies, collaborators, or even employees for Sullivan Strategic Solutions. I began reaching out to some of these former colleagues, ostensibly to catch up on their current projects but actually to gauge their interest in different kinds of professional opportunities. The conversations were carefully calibrated. I wasn't ready to reveal my specific plans, but I wanted to understand who might be open to joining a more entrepreneurial venture if the right opportunity presented itself. Sarah Kim, a brilliant data analyst who had left Morrison Associates 2 years earlier, was particularly intriguing. She had started her own analytics consulting practice but was struggling to find clients who appreciated the sophisticated modeling techniques she had developed. During our coffee meeting in a quiet cafe near the waterfront, she described her frustration with trying to educate potential clients about the value of predictive analytics versus traditional reporting. The established firms don't want to invest in new methodologies, she explained, stirring her latte with obvious agitation. They're comfortable with what they know, even when what they know is becoming obsolete. And the smaller companies that might be interested don't have the budgets to make it worthwhile. I listened carefully, recognizing a potential partnership opportunity but also gaining valuable intelligence about market dynamics that Morrison Associates was completely missing. Sarah's analytics capabilities, combined with my operational expertise and client relationships, could create service offerings that no traditional consulting firm was currently providing. But the most significant development during this foundation building phase came from an unexpected source, James Morrison III himself. 3 weeks before Christmas, he called me into his office for what he described as a year-end performance review. Though our company typically conducted such reviews in February, his office occupied a corner of the building with panoramic views of both the Sound and the city skyline. The walls were lined with awards, photographs of him with various political figures, and framed articles about Morrison and Associates from business publications. He sat behind a desk that was conspicuously clean, no papers, no files, just a laptop, a coffee cup, and a small stack of business cards arranged with geometric precision. "Margaret," he began, his tone carrying the kind of forced warmth that preceded difficult conversations, "I wanted to talk with you about your future here at Morrison and Associates." The phrase, "your future here," immediately put me on alert. In corporate speak, conversations about your future at a company were rarely about advancement opportunities. "As you know," he continued, "we're always looking for ways to optimize our organizational structure to meet evolving market demands. We've been reviewing all of our senior positions to ensure that we have the right people in the right roles for the challenges ahead." He paused, apparently waiting for me to respond, but I remained silent. 37 years of corporate experience had taught me that the person who speaks first in these situations usually reveals more than they intend to. "The thing is," James went on, his discomfort becoming more apparent, "we're moving toward a more technology-focused approach to operations management. Automated systems, AI-driven analytics, cloud-based project management platforms. The kind of operational leadership we need going forward requires a different skill set than what we've relied on in the past." The translation was clear, they considered me too old and too technologically unsophisticated to remain in a senior position. The irony was exquisite, they were planning to push me out just as I was preparing to leave on my own terms. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Well," he said, clearly relieved that I wasn't going to make this more difficult than necessary, "we're thinking about creating a new role for you. Senior Advisor for Client Relations. You'd maintain your current salary and benefits, but you'd focus exclusively on relationship management with our longest-standing clients. Less operational responsibility, more strategic interaction." It was a classic corporate face-saving maneuver, a lateral move disguised as a promotion, designed to push me toward the periphery while avoiding the legal and financial complications of outright termination. In their minds, they were being generous by allowing me to maintain my income while reducing my actual influence and responsibility. "That's an interesting proposal," I said, allowing a note of consideration to enter my voice. "Can I have some time to think about it?" "Of course," James replied, his relief now obvious. "Take the holidays to consider your options. We can discuss the details when you're ready." I walked out of his office feeling a mixture of anger and liberation. The anger was personal. After nearly 4 decades of dedicated service, this was how they chose to handle my obsolescence. But the liberation was strategic. They had just given me the perfect cover story for my transition period. Instead of abruptly resigning and raising questions about my motivations, I could now frame my departure as a response to their organizational restructuring. More importantly, they had revealed their hand. Morrison and Associates was planning significant operational changes, probably involving layoffs and reorganization. This suggested financial pressure that was more severe than their public statements indicated. A company that was thriving didn't typically push out senior employees unless they had compelling reasons to reduce overhead. That evening, I revised my timeline for launching Sullivan Strategic Solutions. Instead of waiting until spring, I decided to accelerate my preparations with a target launch date of February 1st. If Morrison and Associates was planning organizational changes, I wanted to be positioned to benefit from the disruption rather than becoming a casualty of it. I also made a decision that would prove crucial to everything that followed. I began documenting everything. Every client interaction, every project outcome, every operational procedure that I had developed or improved during my tenure. Not to steal proprietary information, but to ensure that I could demonstrate the value I had created and the knowledge I possessed. The documentation process revealed something that even I hadn't fully appreciated. My fingerprints were on virtually every successful project Morrison and Associates had completed in the past decade. The operational frameworks they relied on, the client management protocols they followed, the quality control systems that maintained their reputation, I had either created or significantly improved most of these foundational elements. They could replace me as a person, but replacing the institutional knowledge and operational expertise I represented would be far more challenging than they seemed to understand. This realization shifted my strategic thinking from simple competition to something more ambitious. I wouldn't just be starting a consulting firm that competed with Morrison and Associates. I would be creating an organization that could do what they did, only better, more efficiently, and with greater client satisfaction. The holiday break gave me 3 weeks of uninterrupted planning time. By New Year's Day, I had registered Sullivan Strategic Solutions as a business entity, secured initial financing through a business loan backed by my house, and scheduled meetings with 4 potential clients for the month of January. I had also begun preliminary conversations with 3 former Morrison Associates employees about joining my venture, though I hadn't yet revealed the full scope of my plans. Most significantly, I had identified the perfect office space, Suite 1205 in the Morrison Tower, just 2 floors directly below Morrison Associates offices. The symbolism was irresistible, but the practical advantages were even more compelling. Same building meant access to the same business services, the same networking opportunities, and the same convenient location that clients were already familiar with. It also meant that when I was ready to make my presence known, my former colleagues would have constant visual reminders of exactly what they had chosen to discard. On January 2nd, I returned to Morrison Associates for what I intended to be my final month as an employee. I accepted James Morrison's restructuring proposal with gracious professionalism, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to focus on client relationships while transitioning away from operational responsibilities. My acceptance seemed to relieve any lingering concerns they might have had about potential complications from my departure. They had no idea that they had just given me a front row seat to observe their vulnerabilities during the most critical month of their transition. They had no idea that the senior advisor for client relations they thought they were creating would soon become their most formidable competitor, and they certainly had no idea that the old lady business ideas they had dismissed with such condescending amusement were about to reshape their entire industry. February 1st arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt like an omen. I stood in Suite 1205 of the Morrison Tower at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before the building's official business hours, watching the sun rise over Elliott Bay from windows that offered an almost identical view to the one I had enjoyed 2 floors above for over a decade. The space was smaller than my previous office, but it was entirely mine, 800 square feet of possibility that I had transformed over the past 2 weeks into the headquarters of Sullivan Strategic Solutions. The irony of the location wasn't lost on me. Every morning, my former colleagues would arrive at work in the same elevator bank, walk past the same lobby directory that now listed my company alongside Morrison Associates, and conduct their business just 40 feet above my head. The psychological impact was intentional and, I hoped, unsettling. I wanted them to know that I hadn't simply disappeared into retirement obscurity. I had planted myself directly in their professional ecosystem as a permanent reminder of their miscalculation. The first client meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. with Patricia Williams, the manufacturing executive who had expressed immediate interest when I called her 3 months earlier. Patricia's company, Cascade Components, produced specialized parts for the aerospace industry and had been struggling to implement environmental sustainability measures without compromising their precision manufacturing standards. Morrison Associates had attempted to help them 18 months earlier but had recommended generic sustainability frameworks that were completely incompatible with aerospace regulatory requirements. Patricia arrived 15 minutes early, which I took as a positive sign. She was a woman in her early 50s with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had little patience for corporate nonsense. We sat at the small conference table I had positioned near the windows, with the Seattle skyline providing a backdrop that subtly reinforced the local, accessible nature of my practice compared to the sterile corporate environment upstairs. "Margaret," she said after we had exchanged pleasantries, "I have to tell you, when you called me about starting your own firm, my first thought was, finally." Morrison Associates never understood our industry. They kept trying to apply retail sustainability models to precision manufacturing, which is like trying to fix a Swiss watch with a sledgehammer. Her frustration was immediately apparent, but more importantly, it was specific and actionable. Instead of vague complaints about service quality, she articulated precise problems with concrete business impacts. This was exactly the kind of client feedback that could be translated into competitive advantages. "Tell me about the specific challenges you're facing," I said, pulling out a legal pad rather than opening a laptop. I had learned from my corporate experience that sometimes the most effective client meetings happened when technology didn't create a barrier between consultant and client. For the next hour, Patricia described a complex web of regulatory requirements, supplier constraints, and customer expectations that required a completely customized approach to sustainability implementation. The aerospace industry operated under quality standards that made generic environmental initiatives not just ineffective but potentially dangerous. A single contaminated component could cause catastrophic failures, so any sustainability measure had to be integrated seamlessly with existing quality control systems. "What we need," she explained, "is someone who understands that aerospace sustainability isn't about choosing between environmental responsibility and safety. It's about finding innovative solutions that enhance both simultaneously." As she spoke, I found myself scribbling notes and sketching process diagrams that connected environmental improvements with quality enhancements. My operational background allowed me to visualize the systemic relationships between different manufacturing variables, while my recent research into sustainability trends provided context for emerging technologies that could address her specific challenges. What if, I said, looking up from my notes, instead of treating sustainability as an add-on to your existing processes, we redesigned your waste management system to actually improve quality control while reducing environmental impact? Patricia's eyes lit up with the kind of recognition that every consultant hopes to see. Go on. I spent the next 20 minutes outlining a preliminary approach that integrated real-time environmental monitoring with quality assurance protocols. Instead of separate systems that potentially conflicted with each other, I proposed a unified framework where environmental compliance became a predictive indicator of manufacturing precision. This is exactly what we've been looking for, Patricia said when I finished. Morrison Associates kept talking about sustainability as if it was a marketing exercise. You're talking about it as an operational improvement. By the end of the meeting, I had a signed contract for a 6-month engagement worth $120,000, more than Morrison Associates had charged for their 18-month project that had produced unusable recommendations. More importantly, I had validation that my approach could generate immediate client value in ways that established firms couldn't match. The second breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Marcus Rodriguez's younger brother, Carlos. Carlos was a software engineer who had attended the same networking event where Marcus had once described my business ideas as quaint grandmother thinking. But Carlos had a different perspective on the intersection of technology and business strategy. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon, explaining that he had heard about Sullivan's strategic solutions through industry connections and was interested in discussing a potential collaboration. His software development company specialized in custom applications for small and medium-sized businesses, but he was struggling to find clients who understood the strategic value of tailored technology solutions. Everyone wants to buy off-the-shelf software because it's cheaper upfront, he explained during our coffee meeting the following day. But they don't realize that generic solutions force them to change their business processes to accommodate the software, instead of having software that supports their optimal processes. The parallel to consulting was obvious. Morrison Associates sold standardized frameworks because they were scalable and profitable. But clients needed customized solutions that addressed their specific circumstances and objectives. Carlos was facing the same market dynamic from the technology side. What if we created integrated offerings? I suggested. Strategic consulting. That includes custom technology implementation, so clients get both the framework and the tools they need to execute it effectively. Carlos was immediately enthusiastic. Within 2 weeks, we had developed a partnership agreement that allowed Sullivan Strategic Solutions to offer technology implementation services that were specifically designed to support the strategic recommendations I developed for clients. This gave me a competitive advantage that Morrison Associates couldn't match. They had to refer clients to third-party technology vendors, while I could provide seamless end-to-end solutions. The partnership proved its value almost immediately. A small financial services firm hired us to redesign their client onboarding process and implement the supporting technology systems. The project combined strategic process improvement with custom software development, creating a solution that reduced their onboarding time from 3 weeks to 4 days while improving data accuracy and client satisfaction. But the most satisfying victory came from an unexpected direction: employee recruitment. In mid-March, I received a call from David Park, a project manager who had worked at Morrison Associates for 5 years before leaving to join a larger consulting firm in San Francisco. David was now considering a return to Seattle for family reasons, but he wasn't interested in going back to Morrison Associates. I heard through the network that you started your own practice, he said during our phone conversation. I have to admit, I'm curious. What you're building sounds more innovative than what any of the established firms are doing. David had specialized in organizational change management during his time at Morrison Associates, with a particular focus on helping companies navigate digital transformation challenges. His expertise complemented my operational background perfectly, and his client relationships could accelerate Sullivan's strategic solutions growth significantly. More importantly, David brought intelligence about industry trends that I couldn't have accessed as an outside observer. He described how larger consulting firms were struggling to compete with specialized boutiques that offered deeper expertise in narrow areas. Clients were increasingly willing to work with smaller firms that could provide senior-level attention and customized solutions, rather than junior staff delivering standardized methodologies. The big firms are pricing themselves out of the mid-market, David explained. Companies with $50 million to $200 million in revenue can't afford McKinsey-level fees, but they need more sophisticated help than generic business coaches can provide. That's the sweet spot where firms like yours can really thrive. By the end of March, I had hired David as my first full-time employee and signed contracts with 6 clients representing $480,000 in committed revenue over the next 12 months. Sullivan Strategic Solutions was no longer a startup experiment. It was a viable business that was generating profit from day one. But success brought visibility, and visibility inevitably attracted attention from Morrison Associates. The first sign of their awareness came through Sarah Chen, who reached out to schedule a lunch meeting under the pretense of catching up and discussing potential collaboration opportunities. Sarah had always been the most politically sophisticated member of Morrison Associates' leadership team, and her approach was characteristically subtle. Over salads at a downtown restaurant, she complimented my entrepreneurial initiative while carefully probing for information about my client base, service offerings, and growth plans. "It's wonderful to see you pursuing your own vision," she said, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Though I have to say, we miss your operational expertise. The transition has been more challenging than we anticipated." The admission was revealing. Morrison Associates was struggling with the operational changes they had implemented after restructuring my role. Without my institutional knowledge and systematic approach to project management, they were apparently experiencing quality control issues and client service problems. "I'm sure you'll find your rhythm," I replied diplomatically. "Change is always difficult, but organizations adapt." "Actually," Sarah continued, "I was wondering if you might be interested in some contract work. Nothing that would conflict with your own practice, but perhaps some specialized projects where your expertise would be particularly valuable." The request was transparently desperate. They were offering to hire me as a contractor to solve problems that they had created by pushing me out as an employee. The irony was delicious, but the strategic implications were even more interesting. "That's an intriguing possibility," I said, maintaining a thoughtful expression while internally calculating how to maximize the leverage this opportunity presented. "What kind of projects did you have in mind?" Sarah described 3 different client situations where Morrison Associates was struggling to deliver satisfactory results. In each case, the problem stemmed from their inability to integrate operational improvements with strategic recommendations, exactly the kind of holistic approach that had become Sullivan Strategic Solutions' primary competitive advantage. "I'd be happy to discuss it," I told her, though I should mention that my consulting rates have increased significantly since I started my own practice. Market rates for specialized expertise, you understand. The look that crossed Sarah's face was worth the entire lunch. She was beginning to realize that they had created a competitor who possessed the specific capabilities they now desperately needed, and that competitor was no longer obligated to provide those capabilities at employee-level compensation. As we walked back toward the Morrison Tower after lunch, I felt a profound sense of vindication. 3 months earlier, they had dismissed my ideas as outdated thinking from someone who couldn't adapt to modern business challenges. Now they were essentially asking me to bail them out of problems they couldn't solve themselves, but vindication, I was learning, was just the beginning. I had proven that I could build a successful business and compete effectively in their market. The question now was whether I had the audacity to attempt something far more ambitious, not just competing with Morrison Associates, but systematically dismantling their competitive position until they had no choice but to acknowledge that the old lady they had discarded possessed capabilities they couldn't afford to lose. The answer, I realized as I stood in the elevator that would take me down to my office while Sarah rode up to hers, was an unequivocal yes. April, I had moved beyond proving my viability as a competitor to executing a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to exploit every weakness I had identified in Morrison Associates' business model. Success had given me confidence, but more importantly, it had provided the resources and credibility necessary to pursue a strategy that was far more aggressive than simple market competition. The cornerstone of this campaign was what I privately called talent acquisition warfare. Morrison Associates had always operated under the assumption that their employees were replaceable assets who could be managed through standard corporate HR practices. But my intelligence gathering had revealed that their most valuable contributors were systematically undervalued, creating opportunities for targeted recruitment that could simultaneously strengthen my firm while weakening theirs. My first major recruitment target was Jessica Martinez, a senior analyst who had developed Morrison Associates' most sophisticated client assessment methodologies over the past 4 years. Jessica was brilliant, innovative, and completely invisible to the executive team, who credited her insights to her male supervisor without bothering to understand where those insights actually originated. Through discreet inquiries, I learned That Jessica had been passed over for promotion twice despite generating client recommendations that had resulted in over $2 million in additional revenue. The approach required delicate timing and careful positioning. I couldn't simply poach employees with higher salaries, that would be crude and potentially legal problematic. Instead, I needed to create opportunities that addressed the underlying reasons why talented people were dissatisfied with Morrison and Associates in the first place. I invited Jessica to speak at a small industry panel discussion that I was organizing on emerging analytics in strategic consulting. The panel provided a legitimate professional context for extended conversation while giving Jessica a platform to showcase expertise that Morrison and Associates had never properly recognized. During the networking reception afterward, I mentioned that Sullivan Strategic Solutions was developing a new practice area focused on predictive client modeling and was looking for someone with her specific skill set to lead the initiative. Lead the initiative? Jessica repeated, her surprise evident. You mean actually run the practice area, not just contribute to someone else's vision? I mean build it from the ground up, I clarified. Define the methodologies, establish the client protocols, hire and train additional analysts as we grow. Full ownership of the strategic direction. The conversation that followed revealed everything I needed to know about Morrison and Associates' talent management failures. Jessica had been proposing advanced analytics applications for 3 years, only to watch simplified versions of her ideas be implemented by senior staff who received credit for the innovations. She had developed training materials for junior analysts that had never been formally recognized or compensated. Most frustratingly, she had identified several significant opportunities to expand Morrison and Associates' service offerings, but her recommendations had been dismissed as too ambitious for someone at her level. Within 2 weeks, Jessica had submitted her resignation at Morrison and Associates and accepted my offer to become Director of Analytics at Sullivan Strategic Solutions. Her departure created immediate operational disruptions upstairs, but more importantly, it sent a clear signal to other undervalued employees that alternatives existed. The second phase of my campaign targeted Morrison and Associates' client relationships through a strategy one called Solution Superiority. Rather than competing for new clients, I focused on delivering dramatically better results for existing clients who were dissatisfied with Morrison and Associates' performance. This approach was both more efficient and more demoralizing for my former colleagues, since it highlighted their inadequacies in the most public way possible. The breakthrough opportunity came through Northpoint Industries, a logistics company that had hired Morrison and Associates 18 months earlier to optimize their warehouse operations. The project had been led by Marcus Rodriguez, who had applied a generic efficiency framework without bothering to understand the specific complexities of cold storage logistics. The result was a set of recommendations that looked impressive in PowerPoint but were completely impractical in real-world implementation. Northpoint's CEO, Robert Kim, mentioned their frustration during a casual conversation at a Chamber of Commerce event. Robert was Korean-American, probably in his early 40s, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he had built his business through relentless attention to operational details. When he described the gap between Morrison and Associates' recommendations and their actual operational needs, I recognized an opportunity to demonstrate the superior value of my approach. What if someone could show you how to achieve the efficiency gains they promised, but through methods that actually work with your existing infrastructure? I asked. I'd be very interested in that conversation, Robert replied immediately. The subsequent proposal meeting revealed why Morrison and Associates had failed so spectacularly. They had treated warehouse optimization as a mathematical problem that could be solved through algorithmic analysis of workflow patterns. But cold storage logistics involved temperature-sensitive variables, regulatory compliance requirements, and seasonal fluctuation patterns that couldn't be optimized through generic efficiency models. Working with Jessica's analytical capabilities and Carlos's technology expertise, I developed an integrated solution that addressed Northpoint's specific operational constraints while delivering measurable improvements in both efficiency and compliance. The key insight was that cold storage optimization required real-time environmental monitoring integrated with inventory management systems, exactly the kind of holistic approach that Morrison and Associates was institutionally incapable of providing. The results were dramatic. Within 3 months, Northpoint's operational efficiency improved by 23%, their compliance costs decreased by 15%, and their customer satisfaction scores reached all-time highs. More importantly, Robert Kim began recommending Sullivan Strategic Solutions to other logistics companies, creating a network effect that generated multiple new client opportunities. But the most satisfying aspect of the Northpoint success was its impact on Morrison and Associates' reputation. Robert was vocal about the contrast between their failed approach and my successful intervention, particularly at industry events where both firms were competing for attention. The comparison was devastating because it wasn't based on theoretical differences in methodology, it was based on measurable, publicly verifiable performance outcomes. The third component of my campaign involved strategic partnership development. That positioned Sullivan Strategic Solutions as the preferred alternative for companies seeking innovative consulting approaches. This required building relationships with complementary service providers who could refer clients to my firm while simultaneously reducing the referral opportunities available to Morrison Associates. The most significant partnership emerged through my relationship with Thompson Associates, a boutique legal firm that specialized in regulatory compliance for technology companies. Helen Thompson, the managing partner, had worked with Morrison Associates on several projects and had been consistently frustrated by their inability to integrate legal requirements with business strategy recommendations. They treat compliance like a checklist, Helen explained during our initial meeting. They'll tell clients what they need to do to meet regulatory requirements, but they can't help them understand how to turn compliance into competitive advantage. This observation aligned perfectly with my approach to consulting, which emphasized finding opportunities within constraints rather than treating regulations as obstacles to be minimized. We developed a joint service offering that combined legal expertise with strategic implementation, creating solutions that helped clients exceed regulatory requirements in ways that differentiated them from competitors. The partnership provided immediate credibility for Sullivan Strategic Solutions while giving Thompson Associates access to implementation capabilities they couldn't provide independently. More importantly, it created an exclusive relationship that prevented Morrison Associates from accessing Helen's extensive network of technology clients. By June, the cumulative impact of these strategic initiatives was becoming apparent in Morrison Associates' quarterly performance. They had lost 3 major clients, struggled to replace Jessica's analytical capabilities, and failed to win several competitive proposals where Sullivan Strategic Solutions had emerged as the preferred vendor. The gap between their traditional approach and my innovative methodologies was becoming obvious to clients who now had direct basis for comparison. The psychological pressure on their leadership team was evident during a chance encounter with James Morrison III at a downtown coffee shop. He approached my table with the kind of forced casualness that suggested the meeting wasn't entirely coincidental. "Margaret," he said, his smile tight around the edges, "I keep hearing your name in interesting contexts these days." "Business is good," I replied diplomatically. It turns out there was significant demand for the kind of strategic consulting that integrates operational expertise with innovative thinking. James winced slightly at the implicit criticism. "Listen," he said, glancing around to ensure we weren't being overheard, "I've been thinking about our conversation back in December. Maybe we were too hasty in restructuring your role. There might be opportunities for collaboration that would benefit both of our organizations." The reversal was stunning. 6 months earlier, they had pushed me toward the periphery because they considered my capabilities outdated. Now they were essentially asking me to help them compete with the business I had built using those same supposedly obsolete capabilities. "That's an interesting thought," I said, maintaining a neutral expression while internally savoring the moment. "Though I have to say, my priorities have shifted considerably since I started focusing on strategic innovation rather than traditional operational management." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with James becoming increasingly desperate in his attempts to find common ground for collaboration. He offered consulting contracts, partnership arrangements, even the possibility of acquiring Sullivan Strategic Solutions outright. Each suggestion revealed how thoroughly they had misunderstood both my motivations and my strategic position. As I walked back to my office after the encounter, I realized that the campaign had succeeded beyond my original expectations. Morrison Associates wasn't just struggling to compete with Sullivan Strategic Solutions, they were beginning to recognize that their fundamental business model was becoming obsolete. The question now was whether I was content with competitive success, or whether I had the audacity to pursue the ultimate vindication, not just beating them in the marketplace, but taking their place entirely. July marked the beginning of what I privately called the endgame phase. Morrison Associates' quarterly financial statements, which I obtained through legitimate industry channels and former employee connections, revealed a company in accelerating decline. Revenue was down 18% year-over-year, client retention had dropped to 64%, and their operational costs had increased significantly due to the inefficiencies created by my departure and the subsequent talent exodus I had orchestrated. But numbers on a financial statement only told part of the story. The real opportunity lay in understanding the human dynamics that were driving their organizational collapse. Through careful observation and strategic intelligence gathering, I had identified the specific pressure points that could transform their crisis into my ultimate victory. The most significant vulnerability was James Morrison III himself. As the grandson of the company's founder, James had inherited both the leadership position and the emotional burden of preserving the family legacy. This psychological pressure made him particularly susceptible to solutions that promised to restore the firm's reputation quickly, even if those solutions required painful concessions. My strategy was to position myself as the only person capable of saving Morrison and Associates from complete collapse, but only on terms that would effectively transfer control to me. The opening came through an unexpected source, Marcus Rodriguez. Despite being the person who had most viciously mocked my business ideas during that infamous boardroom presentation, Marcus was now facing the consequences of his own strategic failures. 3 major projects he had led had produced disappointing results, client complaints were mounting, and his position as VP of Innovation was becoming increasingly precarious. Marcus reached out to me through a mutual connection, ostensibly to discuss potential collaboration opportunities but actually to explore whether I might be willing to provide the kind of consulting expertise that could salvage his reputation. The conversation took place at a discreet wine bar in Belltown, far enough from downtown business districts to avoid accidental encounters with colleagues from either firm. "Margaret," he began, his usual arrogance replaced by visible anxiety, "I've been following what you've built with Sullivan Strategic Solutions. It's impressive work." The admission was clearly difficult for him, but desperation had a way of forcing honesty from even the most prideful people. "I'm wondering," he continued, "if there might be ways for us to work together. Your operational expertise combined with my innovation background could create some interesting synergies." The proposal was transparently self-serving, but it also revealed just how thoroughly his confidence had been shattered. Marcus was essentially acknowledging that the old lady business ideas he had dismissed were now his only hope for professional survival. "That's an interesting thought," I replied, allowing a note of consideration to enter my voice. "Though, I have to say, my approach to innovation is quite different from what I've observed at Morrison and Associates. I focus on sustainable competitive advantages rather than trendy technological solutions." The conversation that followed provided invaluable intelligence about the internal dynamics at Morrison and Associates. Marcus described a leadership team that was increasingly fractured, with competing visions for the company's future and no clear consensus about how to address their mounting challenges. Sarah Chen was pushing for aggressive expansion into new markets, Jennifer Walsh was advocating for cost-cutting measures that would essentially turn the firm into a low-cost commodity provider. And James Morrison III was paralyzed by indecision and family pressure. Most revealingly, Marcus admitted that they had tried to implement several of the strategies I had proposed during my tenure, but without my operational expertise, they couldn't execute effectively. They had hired external consultants to help them develop new service offerings, but those consultants didn't understand Morrison and Associates' specific client base or organizational culture. "What we really need," Marcus said, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, "is someone who understands our business from the inside but can bring the kind of innovative thinking that we've been struggling to develop." The opening was perfect, but I couldn't appear too eager. "I can see how that would be valuable," I said thoughtfully. "Though any meaningful collaboration would require a level of strategic authority that I don't think your current leadership structure could accommodate." Marcus's expression suggested he understood exactly what I meant. Any partnership that could actually solve Morrison and Associates' problems would require acknowledging that their existing approach was fundamentally flawed and that I possessed capabilities they couldn't replicate independently. Over the following weeks, I began receiving similar approaches from other Morrison and Associates employees. Jessica Martinez's departure had created a chain reaction of talent flight, with 3 additional analysts submitting resignations and 2 senior consultants actively exploring opportunities with competing firms. The remaining staff were increasingly aware that the firm's prospects were deteriorating, and several reached out to explore whether Sullivan Strategic Solutions might have positions available, but the most significant contact came from Jennifer Walsh, the CFO who had been quietly documenting Morrison and Associates' financial decline and exploring options for stabilizing the company's position. Jennifer was a pragmatist who understood that preserving the organization might require radical changes to its leadership structure and strategic direction. "Margaret," she said during a carefully arranged lunch meeting, "I'm going to be direct with you. Morrison and Associates is in serious trouble. We have maybe 6 months before we're forced to consider bankruptcy or acquisition by a larger firm." The bluntness was refreshing after months of coded conversations and diplomatic language. Jennifer had clearly concluded that traditional corporate politics were less important than finding solutions that could preserve the jobs of the remaining employees and salvage something from the Morrison family legacy. What kind of trouble are we talking about? I asked, though I had a good sense of the answer from my own intelligence gathering. Cash flow problems, client defections, operational inefficiencies that we can't seem to correct, Jennifer replied. The partnership track we offered you in December wasn't just about organizational restructuring, it was about survival. We needed your expertise then, and we need it even more desperately now. She paused, looking directly at me with the kind of intense focus that suggested she was about to propose something significant. I've been authorized by the board to explore acquisition possibilities, she continued. Companies that might be interested in absorbing our client base and operational infrastructure. But I wanted to talk with you first, because you understand our business better than any external acquirer could. The proposition was stunning in its implications. Morrison Associates' board of directors was essentially acknowledging that the company they had inherited from its founder was no longer viable as an independent entity. They were looking for someone to rescue them from the consequences of their own strategic failures, and they were offering me the opportunity to structure that rescue on my own terms. What kind of acquisition are you considering? I asked, maintaining a neutral tone while my mind raced through the possibilities. That depends on what would make sense for both organizations, Jennifer replied diplomatically. Sullivan Strategic Solutions has the growth trajectory and operational effectiveness that Morrison Associates has lost. A merger could combine your innovative capabilities with our established client relationships and infrastructure. The word merger was corporate euphemism for what would actually be an acquisition of Morrison Associates by Sullivan Strategic Solutions, disguised as a partnership to preserve the dignity of the Morrison family and the remaining leadership team. But the underlying reality was clear. They were offering to sell me the company that had dismissed my contributions and mocked my vision. The conversation continued for another hour, with Jennifer outlining various structural possibilities for combining the two firms. Asset purchases, stock transfers, management contracts, licensing agreements. She had clearly done extensive research into acquisition strategies that could address Morrison Associates' financial problems while providing tax advantages and legal protections for all parties involved. But the most intriguing aspect of her proposal wasn't the financial structure, it was the opportunity to demonstrate definitively that the old lady business ideas they had rejected were actually more sophisticated and effective than anything their supposedly innovative leadership team had produced. I'd need to conduct due diligence on Morrison Associates' current financial position, I told Jennifer. Full access to client contracts, revenue projections, operational costs, personnel records. If I'm going to consider any kind of partnership, I need to understand exactly what I'd be acquiring. Jennifer nodded eagerly. Of course. Complete transparency. I think once you see the details, you'll understand why this could be beneficial for everyone involved. Over the following 2 weeks, I conducted the most thorough analysis of Morrison Associates that had ever been performed. Jennifer provided access to confidential financial records, client satisfaction surveys, employee performance reviews, and strategic planning documents. What I discovered was a company that was even more vulnerable than I had realized. The client base that had once been Morrison Associates' primary asset was now fragmenting rapidly. Long-term relationships that had provided steady revenue for decades were being terminated as clients found more innovative alternatives. The operational systems I had developed during my tenure were deteriorating without proper maintenance, creating quality control problems that were damaging the firm's reputation. Most critically, the company had no viable strategy for adapting to the market changes that were reshaping the entire consulting industry. But within that devastation, I saw extraordinary opportunity. Morrison Associates still possessed valuable assets, office space in a premium location, established relationships with key suppliers, a recognizable brand name with significant market equity, and a client list that included companies I had been targeting for Sullivan Strategic Solutions expansion. More importantly, acquiring Morrison Associates would eliminate my primary competitor while doubling my firm's operational capacity overnight. The symbolic value was equally compelling, transforming the company that had rejected me into a subsidiary of the organization I had built from nothing would represent the ultimate vindication of my capabilities and vision. The acquisition strategy one developed was both elegant and devastating. Instead of a traditional buyout that would require significant cash investment, I proposed a management-led restructuring that would transfer operational control to Sullivan Strategic Solutions while allowing the Morrison family to retain nominal ownership of a transformed organization. Under this structure, I would become CEO of the combined entity, with James Morrison III serving as chairman of the board in a largely ceremonial role. Sullivan Strategic Solutions methodologies and client management systems would replace Morrison Associates' outdated approaches, while the most valuable personnel from both organizations would be integrated into a unified team under my leadership. The financial terms were deliberately generous to the Morrison family, offering them a path to preserve their legacy while extracting themselves from the day-to-day operational challenges they were clearly unable to handle. But the practical effect would be complete transformation of Morrison Associates into an extension of my vision and strategic approach. When I presented the proposal to Jennifer Walsh and the Morrison Associates board of directors, the reception was a mixture of relief, resignation, and grudging admiration. They had expected to be acquired by a larger consulting firm that would strip away their identity and eliminate most of their staff. Instead, I was offering them a solution that preserved jobs, maintained the Morrison name, and positioned the combined organization for sustainable growth. James Morrison III's response was particularly telling. After reviewing the proposal in detail, he looked up at me with an expression that combined gratitude with profound humility. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. We should have listened to you months ago. If we had, maybe we wouldn't be in this position." The acknowledgement was satisfying, but I was more focused on the strategic implications of what we were about to accomplish. Within 60 days, I would control the company that had dismissed my ideas as outdated thinking. The old lady they had tried to marginalize would become their boss, their strategic leader, and ultimately their salvation. But first, I needed to ensure that the transition would be executed flawlessly, because the entire consulting industry would be watching to see whether Sullivan Strategic Solutions could successfully integrate a failing competitor into a thriving organization. The stakes were enormous, but so was the opportunity to demonstrate that innovative thinking combined with operational excellence could transform any business challenge into competitive advantage. September 15th was the date we had chosen for what the legal documents euphemistically called organizational integration. In reality, it was the day I would walk into Morrison Associates as its new CEO, 18 months after they had tried to push me into early retirement with condescending remarks about my old lady business ideas. The irony was so perfect it felt almost scripted, but the challenges ahead were entirely real and unforgiving. The weeks leading up to the transition had been a masterclass in corporate psychology and change management. Every conversation, every email, every strategic decision had to navigate the delicate balance between asserting necessary authority and preserving the dignity of people who were already struggling with the humiliation of their organization's failure. I couldn't simply march in as a conquering hero without destroying the very culture and relationships that made the acquisition valuable in the first place. My first major decision involved the physical space itself. The 14th floor of the Morrison Tower had been Morrison Associates headquarters for over 2 decades, with James Morrison III's corner office serving as the symbolic center of power. The traditional approach would have been to claim that office immediately, establishing visual dominance and making clear who was now in charge. But I chose a different strategy entirely. Instead of moving upstairs to the executive floor, I remained in Suite 1205 and transformed the 14th floor into a collaborative workspace that eliminated the hierarchical office arrangements that had reinforced Morrison Associates' dysfunctional culture. The corner office became a client conference center, the individual offices were converted into team project rooms, and the entire space was redesigned around transparency and accessibility rather than status and separation. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. Rather than climbing the corporate ladder to claim the throne that had been denied to me, I was demonstrating that effective leadership didn't require elevated position or isolated authority. The physical transformation of the workspace became a metaphor for the cultural transformation I intended to implement throughout the organization, but symbolic gestures, however meaningful, couldn't address the fundamental operational challenges that had driven Morrison Associates to the brink of collapse. The client satisfaction problems, talent retention issues, and competitive disadvantages that had necessitated the acquisition required systematic solutions that addressed root causes. Rather than superficial symptoms, the first crisis emerged within days of the transition. Meridian Corporation, one of Morrison Associates' largest remaining clients, had scheduled a project review meeting that would determine whether to renew their annual consulting contract worth $340,000. The relationship had been deteriorating for months due to substandard deliverables and missed deadlines, and Meridian's CEO, Linda Chong, had made it clear that this meeting represented Morrison Associates' final opportunity to demonstrate value. The project in question involved supply chain optimization for Meridian's manufacturing operations, exactly the kind of complex operational challenge that required both strategic vision and detailed implementation expertise. Marcus Rodriguez had been leading the engagement using generic efficiency frameworks that completely ignored the specific constraints of Meridian's industry and regulatory environment. I had 48 hours to review 18 months of work. identify the fundamental flaws in Morrison and Associates' approach, and develop an alternative strategy that could salvage the client relationship. More importantly, I had to do this while integrating team members who had never worked under my leadership and who were understandably anxious about their professional futures under the new organizational structure. The solution required leveraging everything I had learned about holistic problem solving during my time building Sullivan Strategic Solutions. Instead of treating supply chain optimization as a purely mathematical exercise, I approached it as a systems integration challenge that needed to account for human factors, technological limitations, regulatory requirements, and market dynamics. Simultaneously, working with Jessica Martinez's analytical capabilities and a team of former Morrison and Associates consultants who had never been given the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to strategic development, I developed a comprehensive supply chain redesign that addressed Meridian's specific operational constraints while creating competitive advantages that their previous optimization efforts had completely missed. The key insight was recognizing that Meridian's supply chain problems weren't actually efficiency issues, they were visibility and coordination problems. Their suppliers were performing adequately, their logistics were reasonably cost-effective, and their inventory management was satisfactory. But information flow between different components of the supply chain was fragmented, creating delays and inefficiencies that appeared to be operational failures but were actually communication breakdowns. The presentation to Linda Chung and her executive team became a demonstration of everything that distinguished my approach from traditional consulting methodologies. Instead of presenting abstract recommendations supported by generic case studies, I walked them through a detailed implementation plan that addressed their specific challenges using solutions tailored to their unique organizational culture and operational constraints. "This is exactly what we've been asking for," Linda said after reviewing the revised supply chain design. "Morrison and Associates kept giving us theoretical frameworks, but you're showing us practical solutions that we can actually implement." The contrast with Marcus Rodriguez's previous presentations was stark and deliberate. Where he had focused on industry benchmarks and best practices, I emphasized Meridian's distinctive competitive advantages and how those could be leveraged through improved supply chain coordination. Where he had recommended standardized software solutions, I proposed custom integration approaches that would enhance their existing systems rather than requiring expensive replacements, but the most significant difference was in the level of ongoing support and partnership that I offered. Traditional consulting engagements involved delivering recommendations and then moving on to the next client. I proposed a collaborative implementation process that would provide continuous optimization and adaptation as Meridian's business environment evolved. "We're not just giving you a supply chain design," I explained to Linda's team. "We're giving you a supply chain management capability that will continue generating competitive advantages long after this specific project is completed." The result exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Meridian not only renewed their consulting contract but expanded it to include additional optimization projects worth over $600,000 annually. More importantly, Linda Chung began recommending our services to other manufacturing executives, creating referral opportunities that had the potential to generate millions in new revenue. But the real victory wasn't financial, it was psychological. The successful Meridian engagement demonstrated to Morrison and Associates' remaining staff that the organizational transformation wasn't just about new ownership or different management structures. It was about fundamentally superior approaches to client service and problem solving that could restore their professional pride and competitive effectiveness. The second major transformation challenge involved rebuilding the firm's reputation within the broader consulting industry. Morrison and Associates' decline had been visible to competitors, clients, and industry observers, creating perception problems that couldn't be solved through improved performance alone. We needed to actively demonstrate that the organization had undergone fundamental changes that made it a more capable and innovative service provider. This required a comprehensive rebranding strategy that positioned the combined Sullivan Strategic Solutions and Morrison and Associates entity as a new kind of consulting firm that integrated strategic vision with operational excellence in ways that traditional firms couldn't match. The key was emphasizing continuity of the most valuable elements from both organizations while clearly communicating that outdated approaches had been eliminated. I decided to retain the Morrison and Associates name for client-facing purposes, recognizing that the brand still carried significant equity despite recent performance problems. But internally, we implemented Sullivan Strategic Solutions methodologies, quality standards, and client management protocols throughout the organization. This approach preserved existing client relationships while ensuring that service delivery would meet the higher standards that had made my original firm successful. The rebranding campaign included strategic placement of thought leadership articles in industry publications, speaking engagements at major consulting conferences, and targeted networking with potential clients who had been dissatisfied with traditional consulting approaches. But the most effective element was leveraging success stories from satisfied clients to demonstrate the practical value of our integrated approach. Patricia Williams from Cascade Components became a particularly powerful advocate, speaking at industry events about how our sustainability consulting had generated measurable operational improvements that traditional firms had been unable to deliver. Robert Kim from Northpoint Industries provided similar testimonials about our logistics optimization capabilities, emphasizing the superior results achieved through our holistic problem-solving approach. These client testimonials were devastating to our traditional competitors because they weren't theoretical comparisons between different consulting philosophies. They were specific, measurable examples of superior performance in real-world business situations. Companies that had worked with McKinsey, Deloitte, or other established firms could directly compare those experiences with the results we were delivering. The third transformation challenge was the most personally satisfying: rebuilding the organizational culture around principles of innovation, collaboration, and respect for diverse perspectives that had been systematically suppressed under Morrison Associates' previous leadership structure. This meant creating opportunities for junior staff members to contribute meaningfully to strategic discussions, establishing transparent communication protocols that prevented valuable insights from being lost or misattributed, and implementing recognition systems that rewarded innovative thinking regardless of the contributor's position in the organizational hierarchy. The cultural transformation was exemplified by our monthly innovation forums, collaborative sessions where anyone in the organization could present ideas for improving client service, developing new capabilities, or addressing operational challenges. These sessions were deliberately designed to encourage the kind of creative thinking that Morrison Associates' previous leadership had dismissed as impractical or unrealistic. The first innovation forum produced 12 substantive proposals for service improvements, including several ideas that came from administrative staff who had never been asked for strategic input under the previous management structure. One particularly insightful suggestion came from Maria Santos, a project coordinator who had observed recurring communication problems between consultants and clients during implementation phases. Maria proposed developing standardized client communication protocols that would ensure consistent information flow throughout engagement life cycles, preventing the misunderstandings and delays that had damaged several client relationships. Her idea became the foundation for a comprehensive client management system that significantly improved satisfaction scores across all active engagements. But the most powerful aspect of the innovation forums was their impact on employee morale and engagement. Staff members who had felt invisible and undervalued under Morrison Associates' hierarchical culture suddenly found themselves contributing to strategic decisions and receiving recognition for their insights. The transformation in energy and commitment was immediately apparent and created a positive feedback loop that enhanced performance across all aspects of the organization. By December, the results of the organizational transformation were undeniable. Client satisfaction scores had improved by 34%, employee turnover had dropped to near zero, and new business development was generating proposals worth over $2.8 million in potential contracts. More importantly, the combined organization was developing a reputation for innovative problem-solving that was attracting clients who specifically sought alternatives to traditional consulting approaches. The ultimate validation came during the annual Pacific Northwest Business Excellence Awards ceremony, where Morrison Associates was recognized as Consulting Firm of the Year based on client testimonials, financial performance, and industry innovation. As I accepted the award on behalf of the organization, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought me to that moment. 18 months earlier, I had been dismissed as an aging employee whose ideas were too outdated for modern business challenges. Now I was being recognized as a leader who had transformed a failing organization into an industry exemplar through innovative thinking and superior execution. But the real satisfaction wasn't in the external recognition, it was in the knowledge that every person who had dismissed my capabilities, mocked my vision, or underestimated my potential was now working for the organization I had built from their failures. The old lady business ideas they had rejected with condescending laughter had become the foundation of their professional survival. As I stood on that stage, holding an award that represented vindication of everything I had accomplished, I realized that revenge was far more satisfying when it took the form of irrefutable success rather than simple retaliation. I hadn't just proven them wrong, I had made them grateful for the opportunity to be part of what I was building. The morning of our 2-year anniversary as a combined organization arrived with the kind of crisp January clarity that made Seattle feel like a city of infinite possibilities. I stood in the same spot where I had once watched ferries cross Elliott Bay as an undervalued employee, but now I surveyed the horizon as the CEO of the Pacific Northwest's fastest-growing consulting firm. The view hadn't changed, but everything else had been transformed beyond recognition. Morrison Associates, or rather, the organization that still carried that name while operating under my strategic vision, had evolved into something unprecedented in the consulting industry. We weren't just another boutique firm that had achieved modest success through specialized expertise. We had become a proof of concept for an entirely different approach to professional services, one that demonstrated how companies could achieve sustainable competitive advantage by fully utilizing human capital that traditional firms systematically undervalued. The numbers told part of the story. Annual revenue had grown from the combined $8.2 million of both firms at the time of acquisition to $23.7 million in our most recent fiscal year. Client retention had stabilized at 94%, compared to the industry average of 67%. Employee satisfaction scores consistently ranked in the top 2% of professional services firms, and our voluntary turnover rate was virtually zero. But statistics, however impressive, couldn't capture the fundamental transformation in how we approached the business of consulting itself. What made our success particularly satisfying was its replicability. We hadn't achieved growth through lucky breaks, market timing, or unsustainable business practices. Instead, we had created systematic approaches to client service, talent development, and operational excellence that could be documented, taught, and scaled across different market segments. This meant that our competitive advantages were sustainable rather than temporary, and our growth trajectory could continue indefinitely as long as we maintained our commitment to innovation and quality. The transformation had attracted attention from far beyond the Seattle business community. Harvard Business School had developed a case study analyzing our organizational integration strategies. The MIT Sloan School of Management had invited me to speak about age discrimination in professional services and how companies could leverage the expertise of older workers more effectively. Most gratifyingly, the same business publications that had once ignored Morrison and Associates were now featuring our story as an example of successful corporate turnaround and innovative leadership, but the most meaningful recognition came from sources that understood the deeper implications of what we had accomplished. The American Association of Retired Persons had honored me with their Entrepreneurial Excellence Award, recognizing the broader significance of proving that professional capability and innovative thinking didn't diminish with age. The National Association of Women Business Owners had featured our story as an example of how women could succeed in male-dominated industries by creating new models rather than trying to fit into existing structures. These acknowledgments represented something more profound than business success. They validated the idea that conventional assumptions about aging, gender, and professional hierarchies were not just wrong but actively counterproductive. Every company that maintained mandatory retirement policies, every organization that subtly pushed older employees toward the margins, every workplace that equated innovation with youth was now demonstrably leaving competitive advantages on the table. The personal transformation had been equally dramatic. At 66, I was more professionally fulfilled than I had ever been during my decades as a corporate employee. Instead of managing other people's visions, I was implementing my own. Instead of being valued primarily for my reliability and compliance, I was recognized for my strategic thinking and innovative capabilities. Instead of feeling invisible in meetings and marginalized in decision-making, I was the person others looked to for leadership and direction. But perhaps the most significant change was in my relationship with risk and uncertainty. Corporate employment, for all its supposed security, had actually been a form of learned helplessness that made me dependent on other people's approval and validation. Entrepreneurship had taught me that the greatest risks often came from playing it safe, while the most rewarding opportunities required the courage to challenge conventional wisdom and trust my own judgment. This shift in perspective had implications that extended far beyond business strategy. I had begun advising other women in their 50s and 60s who were considering career transitions, helping them understand that their accumulated expertise and life experience represented competitive advantages rather than career limitations. The mentoring relationships that emerged from these connections had become one of the most personally rewarding aspects of my professional life. Sarah Kim, the data analyst who had become one of my first strategic partners, had recently launched her own consulting practice specializing in predictive analytics for healthcare organizations. Patricia Williams had leveraged the operational improvements we had implemented at Cascade Components to expand into new aerospace markets, increasing her company's revenue by 47% over 2 years. These success stories demonstrated that the principles underlying our transformation could be applied across different industries and organizational contexts. The ripple effects extended to the broader consulting industry as well. Several established firms had begun recruiting older professionals more aggressively, recognizing that their previous age bias had caused them to overlook valuable talent. Boutique practices founded by experienced professionals were emerging throughout the region, creating more competition for traditional firms that relied on junior staff supervised by senior partners. The entire market dynamic was shifting toward models that prioritized expertise and results over hierarchical credentials and billable hour maximization, but the most delicious irony was how my former colleagues at Morrison Associates had adapted to their new reality. Marcus Rodriguez, who had once dismissed my ideas as grandmother thinking, now enthusiastically promoted the innovative methodologies I had implemented as evidence of his strategic vision. During client presentations, he would describe our integrated approach to consulting as if he had personally developed the frameworks that had transformed the organization's competitive position. Sarah Chen had become one of my most reliable lieutenants, applying her Amazon experience to help us develop scalable systems for client acquisition and project management. The competitiveness that had once made her dismissive of my contributions now channeled into expanding our market share and outmaneuvering traditional competitors. She frequently told industry contacts that working under my leadership had taught her more about strategic consulting than her previous decade of corporate experience. Even James Morrison III had found a role that suited his capabilities and temperament. As chairman of the board, he focused on relationship management with long-term clients and industry networking, activities that leveraged his family connections and institutional knowledge without requiring the strategic decision-making that had proven beyond his abilities. The position allowed him to preserve his dignity while acknowledging that operational leadership required skills he didn't possess. Jennifer Walsh had thrived under the new organizational structure, applying her financial expertise to develop innovative pricing models and performance metrics that gave us competitive advantages in client negotiations. Her systematic approach to cost management and revenue optimization had been crucial to our rapid growth, and she had become a trusted advisor whose recommendations consistently improved our operational efficiency. The transformation of these relationships illustrated something important about professional dynamics and human psychology. The dismissive attitudes they had displayed toward my capabilities hadn't necessarily reflected personal animosity or deliberate cruelty. Instead, they had been products of organizational cultures and industry assumptions that systematically undervalued certain types of expertise and experience. When those structural barriers were removed, most people were capable of recognizing and appreciating contributions they had previously overlooked. This understanding had shaped my approach to leadership and organizational development. Rather than seeking revenge against individuals who had underestimated me, I focused on creating systems and cultures that brought out the best capabilities in everyone while preventing the kind of waste and marginalization that had characterized Morrison and Associates' previous management structure. The consulting practice itself had evolved in directions that validated my original vision while exceeding my initial expectations. Our sustainability consulting division, built around the ideas that had been mocked in that infamous boardroom presentation, now generated over $8 million in annual revenue and had been recognized as the leading practice in the Pacific Northwest. Major corporations throughout the region sought our expertise for environmental compliance, sustainable operations design, and green supply chain optimization. Our integrated technology consulting, developed through the partnership with Carlos Rodriguez, had become a model for how traditional consulting firms could collaborate with technology providers to deliver seamless end-to-end solutions. Instead of referring clients to separate vendors for implementation support, we could provide complete strategic and technical services that ensured consistent quality and accountability throughout project lifecycles. But the most innovative aspect of our practice was our approach to talent development and knowledge transfer. Instead of hoarding expertise within senior partner ranks, we had created systematic programs for developing junior staff capabilities and encouraging innovative thinking at all organizational levels. This approach not only improved employee satisfaction and retention but also generated better client outcomes by leveraging diverse perspectives and fresh insights. The knowledge transfer programs had particular significance for addressing age discrimination and talent waste in professional services. By pairing experienced consultants with younger staff members, we created mentoring relationships that benefited both generations while demonstrating that innovative thinking could come from any source regardless of age or hierarchical position. These programs had attracted attention from other organizations struggling with succession planning and knowledge retention challenges. We had begun licensing our talent development methodologies to companies in different industries, creating new revenue streams while expanding our influence beyond direct consulting services. As I reflected on the journey from that humiliating boardroom presentation to our current position as an industry leader, I realized that the most profound transformation had been in my understanding of what professional success actually meant. For decades, I had defined achievement through traditional metrics: salary increases, title promotions, recognition from hierarchical superiors. But entrepreneurship had taught me that the most satisfying success came from creating value that others couldn't provide and solving problems that others couldn't address. The consulting firm we had built wasn't just a business, it was a demonstration of untapped potential that existed throughout the professional world. Every organization that dismissed older workers as obsolete was overlooking competitive advantages. Every company that equated innovation with youth was missing opportunities for breakthrough thinking. Every workplace that treated experience as a liability rather than an asset was voluntarily handicapping itself in competitive markets. Our story had become a case study not just in business transformation but in social change. By proving that old lady business ideas could outperform conventional approaches, we had challenged assumptions that extended far beyond the consulting industry. The success we had achieved represented vindication not just for me personally but for everyone who had been underestimated, dismissed, or marginalized because of age, gender, or unconventional perspectives. The morning sun was now fully illuminating Elliott Bay, and the ferries were beginning their regular routes between Seattle and the islands. From my office window, I could see the familiar patterns of commerce and transportation that had remained constant throughout all the changes of the past 2 years. But I also knew that beneath those surface consistencies, fundamental shifts were occurring in how businesses operated, how talent was valued, and how success was defined. The phone on my desk buzzed with a call from a potential client, a technology company that had heard about our innovative approach and wanted to explore how we might help them with organizational transformation challenges. As I reached for the receiver, I smiled at the thought that somewhere in a boardroom across the city, someone was probably dismissing the ideas of an older employee who might someday prove to be their most formidable competitor. The cycle of underestimation and vindication would continue, but now there was a new model for how that story could unfold. The next old lady, with supposedly outdated business ideas, would have an example to follow, a path to pursue, and proof that age could be a competitive advantage rather than a career limitation, and that knowledge, I realized, was the most valuable legacy of everything we had accomplished. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.